The era of Reconstruction in the United States from 1863 until 1877, the politics of Reconstruction, which means should it be controlled by the president or the executive branch as an effort of the Civil War and its aftermath, or should it be controlled by Congress? And so that's the questions that we must be answered. Now, when we talk about Reconstruction, when the Civil War ends in April of 1865, Reconstruction had already been discussed by the president and by Congress since 1863. And there's many questions that have to be answered in the era of Reconstruction, which means to rebuild. And so the one big question is, how do we bring the South back into the Union? Do we punish the Southern states for what they did? Do we not allow them to be active in the United States for a certain period of time? Do we fine them? How do we hold the former Confederate officials and generals guilty of or in certain crimes? But really is, how do we bring back the former Southern states into the United States? Another question is, how do we rebuild the South after its destruction in the war? Now, rebuilding the South becomes a big issue because by 1864, the war is no longer about defeating an army on a field outside of towns. The United States Army went through the Deep South, for instance, Georgia and South Carolina, and they destroyed everything in sight. They burned down Atlanta. They had their march to the sea from Atlanta to Savannah in the fall of 1864 and 1865, in which they burned farms, destroyed railroads, destroyed towns. Well, how do we rebuild them? And in what nature? Another big question that's not truly answered during the era of Reconstruction is, how do we integrate and protect newly emancipated black freedmen? You have 4.5 million people freed in the South. Do you just let them go because you've abolished slavery? Do you give them land? Do you have a true revolution and make them politically powerful while the former Confederate officials can't hold office? There's a lot of questions that have to be dealt with. And also, what branch of the government should control the process? There's an argument to be made that Reconstruction is another wing of the war. Thus, being commander-in-chief of the United States, the president should control this process of Reconstruction, while people in Congress would say, no, the war is over. It is up to Congress to decide the nature of the Reconstruction. So there is something called wartime Reconstruction. From 1863 until 1865, there is plans already being developed about what is the United States going to do when this war is over. Abraham Lincoln would introduce his first plan in December of 1863. And in December of 1863, Lincoln's plan was called Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction. Now, what you have to understand is Lincoln's mindset with his plan, sometimes called the 10% plan, is with malice towards none and charity for all. Let's not punish anybody, and let's be as charitable, as nice as we possibly can be when it comes to Reconstruction. And so, when he talks about amnesty, he's talking about what do you do with the millions of people that were active in the Confederate military and in the Confederate government. And according to Lincoln, you pardon all but the highest government and military officials. So all you had to do to receive this pardon from the president was simply take an oath of allegiance. It was not a very intensive process. A lot of times, if you were an average Confederate soldier, before you were allowed to walk back to your town or farm in the South, you had to put up your right hand and just simply take an oath of allegiance that I uphold the Constitution, and they'll let you go. Unless you were a high Confederate government official, a high-ranking military official, Lincoln really hadn't articulated what he wanted to do with that. But his goal was to get people back and end this war. He said Southerners must accept the end of slavery, although Lincoln's 10% plan is not really that specific when it comes to the rights of the freedmen being the former slave. He really was able to articulate that yet. He was hoping step number one is let's undermine the Confederacy and form new states, and then let's deal with the slavery issue later, because his plan really dealt with something called the 10% plan. All Lincoln wanted to do, starting in 1864, was to set up new governments in the South that were loyal to the United States as the war is still going on. And so, according to the 10% plan, only 10% of the people who voted in 1860 had to take an oath of allegiance. So if you had 1 million people vote in the election of 1860, once 10% of those people, now this is for Confederate states only, once 10% of those people took a loyalty oath, those states could form new governments loyal to the United States, elect members to the House of Representatives, elect members to the Senate. And by 1864, 3 Lincoln governments, as they were called, were formed. You had a Lincoln government in Louisiana, one in Tennessee, and another in Arkansas. And remember, the Lincoln plan, why? Because he wants to end this war. And he is hoping that by creating loyal governments to the United States, even if it's only 10% of the population, establishing loyal governments in these Confederate states will undermine the war effort and bring this war to a close sooner. You notice I didn't mention much what to do with the former freedmen because Lincoln really didn't know what to do. Hadn't got to that yet. He was hoping one step at a time. Let's deal with the pressing issue of ending the war, and then let's deal with what to do with the former slave. Now, members of Congress did not like this. These groups of people that really wanted to punish the South for what they did were called radical Republicans. Radical Republicans wanted to make Reconstruction difficult, and they also wanted to protect the rights of the former slave. And so Republicans in Congress objected to the president's plan. They said it's way too lenient, 10% of the population. What about the 90% that don't take an oath? And nothing really about the former slave. We fought this war. 500 and 600,000 people are going to die in this war. And, we're not going to discuss that issue in our Reconstruction bill. And so they said 10% was not enough, would lead to unloyal governments, unstable governments in the United States. 90% of the people technically would not support the United States nor their state government. So 10% Lincoln, not enough. They required 50% to take an oath of allegiance. 50% of those people who voted in the election of 1860 and are still alive have to take a loyalty oath back to the United States. 50% would be the bare minimum they would allow. 10% not enough. They also, specifically in the Wade Davis bill, protect freedmen's rights. Freedman means former slave. Now, what rights does that mean? It means voting rights, property rights, social rights. Yes and no in some of those ways. Now, Lincoln does not want to sign this bill into law. It's called a Wade Davis bill, created in Congress, passes the Senate, goes to President Lincoln. He doesn't want to pass this bill, but the radical Republicans are very popular, so he doesn't want to openly veto it. So there's actually something called a pocket veto. And a pocket veto is another way for a president to reject a bill without actually having to sign anything. What happens is when Congress sends a bill to the president and then Congress adjourns or goes home to their home states and Congress isn't in session, if a president doesn't sign that bill after 10 days, it disappears. It's been pocketed. And so what Abraham Lincoln does is, here comes the Wade Davis bill. He doesn't like it. Congress adjourns, so Congress is not in session. They go back to their home states. Abraham Lincoln will not sign it, nor will he veto it. It is pocket vetoed. It disappears after 10 days, and it must be introduced again in the next congressional session. By 1865, as the war is winding down, the North is doing many things to really change the nature of the United States, but also to help the South, specifically the poor Southerners and the former slaves. So in March of 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was created, or the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. And many former Northern abolitionists risked their lives to help the Southern freedmen. Northern abolitionists wanted to ban slavery. Now that slavery, for the most part, has come to the end, still working on to officially ban or end slavery in the United States, because the Emancipation Proclamation technically only banned slavery in states of rebellion. So it doesn't technically in writing ban slavery. And so these Northern abolitionists, they went south. They were called carpetbaggers. And there's many reasons why these Northerners went south. Now, white Southern Democrats called them carpetbaggers because there was a suitcase back then that looked like it was a kind of folded up carpet. And so there's those Northerners, there are those Northern abolitionists, those are those carpetbaggers. And so the Freedmen's Bureau itself was designed to provide food, shelter, and medical aid to both blacks and whites. We are most familiar with its greatest success, and the greatest success for the Freedmen's Bureau is it set up 3,000 schools for freed blacks in the South. Many Northern abolitionists came south to teach at these schools. Some Northern abolitionists came down to make sure that the former slaves were registered to vote and voted Republican. And some carpetbaggers came south to exploit the South economically. But for the most part, its biggest success was setting up 3,000 schools, which during the day, the freedmen's children would go to school during the day. And then at night, the adults would go to these schools learning to read and write, because that was something denied to them. Remember, it was illegal for slaves to read and write, and this was something that they wanted to do. And by 1870, the funding for the Freedmen's Bureau had ended. It was a 5-year program. So there's carpetbaggers. You can see on the left side how they're dressed, but also you can see in the left hand of the gentleman wearing that is the popular suitcase, and there's the carpetbag suitcase. Then even worse to Southerners is someone called a scallywag. A scallywag is a Southerner. See, it's one thing to be a carpetbagger. You're from the North, but a scallywag is a Southerner who supports the Freedmen's Bureau, who supports the Republican Party, who wants to help the former slave. That's worse. A scallywag is supposed to be insulting. And this is a Southern perspective of what you should do to carpetbaggers and scallywags. There's the Ku Klux Klan donkey, and it has hung a carpetbagger, because you can see by its bag it says Ohio, and a scallywag. Also, the Freedmen's Bureau was portrayed like this when it comes to Southern newspapers. The agency to keep the former slave in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made law by Congress, support Congress and support the former slave. And you can see the caricature of the former slave in all of the cartoonish features it has, lying back, not doing any work, which is so far from the truth, and the white man doing all the work. We will see socially, when we talk about sharecropping and tenant farming, that what the realities were for most of the former slaves. So this obviously is propaganda to attack the Freedmen's Bureau. There's a Freedmen's Bureau school, because this is what they actually did. Now, remember, I said there were some issues with the Emancipation Proclamation because of the way it's written. So in April of 1865, the Senate would pass the 13th Amendment on April 8th, 1865. And then by December of 1865, 3/4 of the northern states had passed the 13th Amendment, because 3/4 of the states must pass an amendment before it becomes law. And the 13th Amendment simply abolished slavery in the United States. That's what it did. Abolishes slavery in the United States. It's a continuation of the Emancipation Proclamation. Because specifically, the Emancipation Proclamation, to some folks, did not ban slavery. It just banned slavery in rebelling states. But it does make slavery a war aim. So now that the war is over, April of 1865, when the war does end, now you abolish slavery. Now, Lincoln wouldn't really see much of this, because he won the election of 1864. And then here is his March 4th, 1864 inaugural address. And you can see in the background from Lincoln is John Wilkes Booth. John Wilkes Booth is a Southern sympathizer, lives in Washington, D.C., and next to his name, you can see Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always the tyrant, the state motto of Virginia. That'll come in handy. So in April of 1865, it's the end of wartime Reconstruction because not only does the war end, but 1 month after his inaugural address, Lincoln will be assassinated. Now, even in 1864, John Wilkes Booth and some of his cohorts had wanted to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, take him to the South, and then negotiate the end of the Civil War with the South remaining in place. John Wilkes Booth was from a famous acting family. John Wilkes Booth's father and brother were both pro-North, probably more famous than John Wilkes Booth. In 1864, the plan to kidnap Abraham Lincoln didn't work out. Early 1865, John Wilkes Booth and his cohorts wanted to assassinate not only Abraham Lincoln, but the Secretary of War and the Vice President, hoping that if they kill the upper echelon of the United States government, that the South would get a very lenient Reconstruction. But nothing much came from the plan. They had planned, they had met several times, but they just never really could know where Abraham Lincoln was going to be. So on the morning of April 14th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth goes to Ford's Theater because John Wilkes Booth is an actor. He actually gets his mail there. And while that morning of April 4th, 1865, you overhear some other actors talking, saying, hey, you know, the president's going to come here tonight to watch the very famous British play called Our American Cousin. And he's going to be here. He's going to be in the presidential booth. And he's going to come and watch this play. And you can see from the inside of Ford's Theater, there's the presidential booth. And John Wilkes Booth goes, now we know where he's going to be at. Because before this time, they could never get their plan in order because he didn't really know where people were going to be at, especially the president. So John Wilkes Booth hastily gets his cohorts together and says, I know where the president's going to be. The other people just go to their homes and hopefully they'll be there. And so that night, Abraham Lincoln would ask Ulysses S. Grant to join him, to join Lincoln and his wife to watch Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. But Grant was going to a train, had to be on a train to go to Philadelphia because there was going to be a big party commemorating the end of the Civil War. So Grant declined, several other people declined. Eventually, he gets some other officers and the officer's wife to join him in the presidential box. As the play begins, there is one guard outside of Abraham Lincoln's presidential box. It's kind of boring, so the guy's going, oh, this is going to take forever. I'm just staring at a wall. John Wilkes Booth at this time, around 8 o'clock at night, he is across the street. Across the street is a bar. John Wilkes Booth is getting some liquid courage. And then with about a half hour after the play has started, who walks in? But the guy, the soldier who was guarding the presidential box. A half hour of guarding a presidential box was kind of boring, so he snuck across the street to get a drink. And John Wilkes Booth was like, this is great. John Wilkes Booth had brought with him a gun and a knife. The knife was to stab the guard as quietly as possible, and the gun was to shoot the president. Well, now that the guard isn't at the door, because, John Wilkes Booth had scoped and, scouted out the booth right before the play, so he knew there was a guard there. John Wilkes Booth scurries across the street, walks right past people saying, hey, hello, hi, hey, because he gets his mail there. And he gets into the presidential box and stands up right behind Lincoln's head and takes one shot to the back of Lincoln's head. It would be a mortal wound. Lincoln would die the next day from his wounds. He died that morning. John Wilkes Booth would jump out of the presidential box, break his leg upon impact of the stage. And some people believe when he was scurrying across the stage, he said, Sic Semper Tyrannis, and that's the Virginia state motto. He would scoot outside where an accomplice would be there with him with a horse. So him and his accomplice would get out of D.C. Eventually, April 15th, the next day, John Wilkes Booth would have a broken leg set because when John Wilkes Booth jumped out of the presidential box onto the stage, he broke a leg. So he broke his lower leg. So imagine trying to ride a horse with that. But he did. Eventually, they hit out on the Maryland side of the Potomac. Eventually, they got across. And about 2 weeks later, around April 23rd, April 24th, 10 days later after the assassination of Lincoln, the United States Cavalry caught up with John Wilkes Booth and his accomplice at the Garrett Farm, which is, north up I-95 from here, but before Fredericksburg. And although the United States Cavalry had orders to take John Wilkes Booth alive, a soldier would shoot and kill John Wilkes Booth. And Lewis Powell, one of the accomplices who was supposed to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward, well, he actually got into William Seward's house, forced his way in, and he got into William Seward's bedroom, and then as he gets by the bed to stab and kill the Secretary of State, the Secretary of State isn't there. The Secretary of State a couple days earlier had been in a carriage accident, so the Secretary of State is actually off to the side of his bed, sleeping on a couch, because he found it easier with his injuries from the carriage accident to kind of sleep sitting up. And so by the time Lewis Powell noticed that, William Seward's sons had come in there and tackled him. And there's a picture of Lewis Powell awaiting his fate on a prison ship on the Potomac River. George Axelrod, his target was Andrew Johnson, but he chickened out. And he spent most of the night just wandering around D.C. because he got lost. He didn't really know D.C. that well. Eventually, he returned so late to the hotel he was staying at, the United States Army was already there waiting for him. And eventually, there's Lincoln in the rotunda being watched over. Then his body was taken around the United States on kind of a funeral tour. This is the Lincoln casket going through downtown New York. It passes the Roosevelt House. And you can see on the second floor 2 little blurry figures. That is a 7-year-old Theodore Roosevelt and his younger brother watching the casket roll by. And then eventually, George Axelrod, Lewis Powell, the person who helped John Wilkes Booth escape out of D.C., and Mary Surratt, who ran a tavern where a lot of the planning had been done, they were hung. This would lead to a short time from 1865 until 1866 presidential reconstruction under Andrew Johnson. And this would be a constant battle. Andrew Johnson was put on Lincoln's ticket in 1864 because Andrew Johnson was a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican, so you wouldn't see this often. But remember, Democrats dominated the South, so Andrew Johnson was a Democrat who was a Southerner who was loyal to the United States. So Lincoln was hoping Andrew Johnson would help him commence Reconstruction. But Andrew Johnson's problem is he was extremely racist. And the radical Republicans, such as Congressman Thaddeus Stevens from Pennsylvania, and Andrew Johnson would argue over the nature of the Reconstruction from 1865 until 1868. So the only thing Johnson did is he added to Lincoln's Reconstruction plan, his 10% plan. He added a few things. He was a little more specific on the idea of former Confederate leaders. And he said, anybody can be pardoned, except for former Confederate leaders and anybody who had over $20,000 in property, that could be land or business. Anybody who had over $20,000 of property could not be granted a general pardon. A general pardon by him was simply, you're free, you're pardoned, you can go back to your state, you can vote again like nothing ever happened. Unless you have over $20,000. If you have over $20,000, according to the additions to the 10% plan, you had to personally come to Washington, D.C., or have somebody who represents you come to Washington, D.C., and personally apply to the president, Andrew Johnson, to be pardoned. And so Andrew Johnson pardoned all that applied. The only person that was never pardoned was Jefferson Davis. But everybody, by the summer of 1865, there was hundreds and hundreds of attorneys and some Confederate officials waiting in line at the White House to get a general pardon because they had over $20,000 worth of property. And Andrew Johnson pardoned them all. And then these people went back to their states, and their states held elections in the summer of 1865 for the new fall Congress. And what was funny, by the fall of 1865, when Congress reconvened with their new southern states back in the Union, all these former Confederate officials and military officials and generals and stuff were reelected like nothing had happened. The former vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, was reelected as senator of Georgia. That's when the radical Republicans said, no way, you guys ain't going to be allowed to take your seats. They said, get out of here. And so they were thrown out. The Southerners were not allowed to accept their seats because as radical Republicans saw it, what the heck? It's like nobody's being punished for this. And so that's when the radical Republicans, because they had so much power by the fall of 1865, they had so much power in Congress, they can override any veto by the president. And so that's when the Congressional Reconstruction began. The first thing they did is they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, because even though slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, a lot of rights were being violated upon the former slaves, the freedmen in the South. And so the radical Republicans would create the bill, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, protected rights of African Americans. It said African Americans, the former slaves, equal protection under the law, which, because by this time the South was creating something called black codes, which were openly laws at the state level that were openly violating the rights of the former slaves. And so this would help undermine those black codes. Of course, Andrew Johnson would veto it, because Andrew Johnson believed this: any law specifically designed to help the former slaves or the black man violated the rights of the white man. He was just the worst person to have at a time like this. Vetoed by President Johnson because Johnson believed any law specifically designed to protect the rights of the former slaves or the black man violated the rights of the white man. Congress overrode this veto. Congress said, sorry, not happening. So Congress overrode this veto, became law. And then on top of this, because of some other issues from previous court decisions and other things that happened before the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was passed. Passed by the Senate June of 1866, after all the issues with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Ratified by 3/4 of the states in 1868. It says all people born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. Because even though the 13th Amendment banned slavery, according to the Dred Scott decision, the Dred Scott decision did more than saying slaves are property. It said if you are a freeman or a free person in the North, you're not a citizen of the United States. This happened in 1857, so you've got to change that. 14th Amendment says that. It also gave people equal protection under the law, which means you can't create laws specifically going after one portion of the American people. With the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment when it comes to civil rights. And we'll use it consistently over the next, rest of the year. Now, when Andrew Johnson took his oath of office with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, remember his group of advisors, remained. And many of the advisors from Lincoln's cabinet were radical Republicans. And by 1867, the cabinet members hated Andrew Johnson. Among them was the Secretary of War, William Stanton. Stanton detested Andrew Johnson. And according to the Constitution, the president nominates who he wants to head the cabinet. For instance, Lincoln would have nominated this for Secretary of War, William Stanton, in 1860. The Senate approves. Now, if the president wants to remove a cabinet member, all they have to do is just say, listen, to the cabinet member, listen, you either resign or I'm going to remove you. Now, what happens is Congress wants to protect the cabinet members that were radical Republicans, like Secretary of War Stanton. So in 1867, over the veto of Andrew Johnson, the Congress would pass the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act simply says, if the president wants to remove a cabinet official, the president needs congressional approval. Remember, originally the Constitution, it says the president doesn't need congressional approval to remove a cabinet official. Well, according to the Tenure Office Act, it is saying, yeah, president, you want to remove a cabinet member, you have to get congressional approval. Now, you would ask yourself, wouldn't this be unconstitutional? That's what Andrew Johnson thought, and eventually most scholars believe it would have been deemed unconstitutional. But what happens is Andrew Johnson believes it's unconstitutional, so he goes, fine, you're going to play this game? Andrew Johnson, he would fire Secretary of War Stanton. So technically, Andrew Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act. And that's exactly what the radical Republicans in Congress are waiting for, because the president has broken a law, and that can lead to impeachment, which means removal. According to the Constitution, The House of Representatives, they draw up the charges. They impeach the president. Impeach means here is what the president has done or the laws they have violated that necessitates the impeachment of the president. So the House drew up the charges. Andrew Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing the Secretary of War Stanton. Then the House of Representatives sends the charges to the Senate. The Senate acts as the jury. Members of the House or other government officials can act as the prosecuting attorney, and the president, like Andrew Johnson, would have a defense attorney. And here it is. Here is the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in front of the Senate. At that time, there was 54 senators. In order to impeach the president, you need a 2/3 vote. So in order to impeach Andrew Johnson on the crime of violating the Tenure of Office Act, you needed 36 senators to vote to impeach. In the end, 35 senators voted to impeach. Thus, Andrew Johnson was saved by one vote, but politically he was done. And in 1868, the Republicans nominated Ulysses S. Grant because he was a war hero, although politically very naive. The Democrats would nominate New Yorker Horatio Seymour. And of course, the main issue is going to be the nature of the Reconstruction. You know, Ulysses S. Grant is part of the radical Republican wing that, although Grant wants to be a little more lenient on the Southerners, he does believe that the right to the freedmen must be protected. He does believe there should be a military occupation of the South, which had been going on since 1865. He also believes that the South should be punished for what they did. While the Democrat Horatio Seymour said, the states are back in, Civil Rights Act has been passed, let's just move on. And that was more the Southern position, let's move on. And so the Republican strategy was to wave the bloody shirt, which means is to simply remind people that, hey, the Republicans were the ones who won the Civil War. And the Republican strategy would work in the South because there were still many Southerners who were not allowed to vote in 1868. And there was a growing number of African Americans who were voting, especially in the South because of the military occupation. But there were still issues with voting. But the Republican strategy was simply wave the bloody shirt. And this worked in the South in 1868 and 1872 to remind people, especially the 500,000 African Americans who voted, hey, the radical Republicans are the North set you free, you're going to vote Republican. Although there were still issues, as you can see, it's in some of the areas that were not as tightly controlled by the United States military in the South, African Americans were denied the right to vote. But Grant still won the election of 1868, and Grant would actually say the votes of the 500,000 African Americans carried the election for me. And you can see they did. And because of issues regarding voting in the 1868 election, because you would say, well, obviously, the 13th Amendment bans slavery, the 14th Amendment makes them citizens of the United States, so black males should have the right to vote. But that wasn't always the case. So the final, what we call Civil War Amendment, is the 15th Amendment. The Civil War or Civil Rights Amendments are the 13th through 15th. The 15th Amendment was passed by the Senate in February of 1869, ratified by 3/4 of the states by 1870, banned franchise restrictions based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Franchise is a nice term for saying voting. Banned voting restrictions based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Some areas in the South that were not tightly under the military control of the United States, they would go, when a former slave or would come up to vote, the Southerners who were controlling the precincts would say, were you a former slave? And they would say, well, yes. Okay. And then, of course, they were told, you can't vote. That's what they were doing. They would even go, was your grandfather a slave? Yep, then you can't vote. And so even though you would say, well, the 13th and 14th Amendment alleviates those issues, there were still issues over voting. Now, Grant, as president, urged radical Republicans not to be harsh with the former Confederates. It's like, yeah, they're under military control. We are protecting the rights of the former freedmen, but don't push it too far because you're going to cause more and more issues. advocated for the rights of freemen. We'll see what Grant will do when it comes to extinguishing the Ku Klux Klan. He opposed retribution directed at the defeated South. He's like, not too much punishment. Now, what's interesting is in 1867 in Pulaski, Tennessee, the Ku Klux Klan was formed. And originally, the Ku Klux Klan was formed as a social fraternity as former Confederate soldiers would get together to reminisce about the war. By 1868, as African Americans and Republicans and others became more and more powerful politically, that's when the Ku Klux Klan would become a paramilitary group with its goals to stop African Americans from voting and also stop African Americans from becoming politically active or becoming socially prominent. And they would do this through intimidation, through fear, through cross burnings, through lynchings, which means literally hanging somebody from a tree if they persisted. And so Grant had enough. After 3 years of this, he's like, enough of this violence is enough. And so although the United States military was set up in the South, Grant, through force bill in 1870 and 1871, created another group within the United States Army in the South that was specifically designed to go after people making it difficult for African Americans. And so the force bill, the first Klan Act, as it was called, prohibited discrimination by state officials in voter registration on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And so, once again, this small group of United States soldiers and officers can go into certain areas of the South and make sure that African Americans are registered to vote. Also, establish penalties for interfering with a person's right to vote. If you did this, you could go to jail, and gave federal courts the power to enforce the act. Authorized the president to employ the use of the Army to uphold the act, and the use of federal marshals to bring charges against offenders for election fraud. So he had more troops go down and specifically target election fraud, target fraudulent election officials, target people that were actually intimidating the former slaves, and it was quite effective. It still necessitated the Second Klan Act of 1871 permitted federal oversight of local and state elections if any two citizens in a town with more than 20,000 inhabitants desired it. So if there's a town of 25,000 people and a couple people say there's a lot of voting problems here, we know that, for instance, the election of 1872, this town is going to try to prevent African Americans from registering to vote. It's going to prevent African Americans from voting, or the groups may intimidate African Americans from not voting. Then you could file a paper or a document with the federal government. The federal government would actually bring down election officials and this special little armed group within the United States Army to make sure that the elections are held and that the elections are held fairly. It was really established to extinguish the Klan. And by 1872, because of these laws and because the federal government enforced these laws, the Klan was extinguished and went underground for a long time until the turn of the 20th century. The final thing, major political event of Reconstruction under Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Because even by 1875, as the North starts moving away, the average Northern citizen said, like, well, the Civil War was 10 years ago, and there wasn't as much oversight of the South by 1875, the South starts creating laws, which would later become known as Jim Crow laws, to separate the races. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was passed, guaranteed equal treatment in public accommodations and public transportation. So there would be no back of the bus, or there would be no there shouldn't be a separate white rail car and a black rail car, a separate, hospital and separate parks and stores. It also allowed African Americans to serve on juries. And once again, this law was enforced. Unfortunately, although this was a law in 1875, you would say to yourself, well, then why did all these things happen later on? Because by 1877, when Reconstruction ends, most Northerners, and specifically Northern politicians, they didn't want to spend the amount of tax money or the money to enforce all these things, so they kind of just let the South go and didn't enforce anything. And the South was allowed to reestablish political control, establish Jim Crow laws, and really made African Americans second-class citizens in the South.